The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
It would be a stretch to say they warned us, but still, some fiction writers anticipated this pandemic with an eerie accuracy. Tonight, we've gathered three outstanding Canadian authors whose new books almost seem to have known COVID-19 was headed this way. Then, we'll hear how libraries in Ontario found ways to lend helping hands, along with books, even during the height of this crisis. It's Tuesday, November 17th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Who could have imagined this pandemic is a question many have asked during this most challenging year. Well, in fact, it turns out that many writers have envisioned such events dating back centuries to previous plagues and epidemics. Among them are three incredibly skilled Canadian authors. They all have new books out which were written before COVID hit, but that capture the essence of this kind of event as perhaps only fiction can. Let's find out more and introduce our guests, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio. In Brooklyn, New York, Emily St. John Mandel, author of several novels, including Station 11 and the just published The Glass Hotel. In North Hatley, Quebec, Salima Nawaz, whose latest book is Songs for the End of the World. And in London, Ontario, Emma Donoghue, whose most recent book is titled The Pull of the Stars. And it's great to have you three, speaking of stars, you three superstars with us tonight here on TVO. I want to go around our virtual table here and explore what you three have written. And Emma, I'll start with you because your book takes us back 100 years to the previous global pandemic, the Spanish flu. When did you decide you wanted to write about that time?
October 2018, I was reading an article in The Economist about the centenary of the Great Flu. And I was just so seized by the idea that it would have had a sort of almost a post-apocalyptic atmosphere, because this was a busy modern time, people, dashing to work on trams and buses and using electric light. It was our kind of world, but everything had to suddenly grind to a halt. So I decided I'd write a novel with no thought of contemporary relevance. And I handed in the last draft on the 3rd of March this year, and then was completely overwhelmed and startled by any, link to COVID.
Well, that's the thing I want to nail down. When you were thinking about this for the first time in 2018, you had no inkling that you were actually going to be on the most important topic 2 years hence.
It just proves that you should always write about what interests you rather than trying to anticipate the trends, because it's not like you could have seen it coming.
That is fascinating. Okay, Salima, the title of your book, Songs for the End of the World, does suggest that an apocalyptic pandemic is on the way. When did you decide to write that?
I first planned it in the fall of 2012 and then wrote it between 2013 and 2019.
And similarly, any premonition that a coronavirus would be in our future in the way that it is?
No, not at all.
So what do you want to call that? Just incredible prescience or dumb luck or what?
One of the two.
Well, let's go with incredible prescience, shall we?
Sure.
Makes sense to me. Emily, it's been 6 years since you wrote Station 11, which also presages the end of the world by a pandemic. And I guess I'll ask you the same question. Did you have a hunch when you wrote it that a massive global pandemic that was going to kill hundreds of thousands of people was on its way?
Not specifically, but what very quickly becomes clear if you research the history of pandemics is that the history of humanity is a history of pandemics. We've just been struck by one pandemic after another. And what really struck me in the research for Station 11 is that epidemiologists talk about pandemics really in the same way that seismologists talk about earthquakes, which is to say that no serious person asks, I wonder if there will ever again be another earthquake. There will always be another earthquake, and there will unfortunately always be another pandemic. It's just part of our history.
That is true, and yet even as recently as SARS, which was 2003, we got the sense after SARS was over that, yes, 44 people died in Toronto, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Thankfully, we have dodged that with no thinking that the next one was just around the corner. you have any idea why we think that way?
I think it was a mass failure of imagination. You know, I find myself a little bit haunted by the period immediately before the pandemic, which is to say 3 weeks or so before Emma handed in her novel in February into very early March, where even though we knew what was coming, we could read the headlines, we were still shaking hands with strangers and taking our kids to school. You know, so it's like that condition of knowing but not knowing something at the same time. I think it somehow seemed unimaginable, even when it was being reported in the New York Times, which, you know, is probably more for a psychologist to comment on than me, but I am fascinated by it.
Indeed. How many copies of Station 11 did you sell?
Quite some number.
I know. I'm asking you to be a little more specific than that.
You know, I actually don't have the numbers in front of me.
So do we just say a lot, or do we say hundreds of thousands or millions, or what do we say?
Since the pandemic broke, yeah, let's just say a lot. I haven't done the analysis for the period.
A lot works for me. Okay, that's fine. Salima, let's do an excerpt from your book. Here we go, from Songs for the End of the World. He did not really think that the human race would come through with flying colors, not ethically. People with power would fear losing it, fueling unwarranted instances of panic that would no doubt be distorted out of all proportion by the media. At a certain point, all governments traded in utilitarianism, and surviving a pandemic would become a numbers game, with the penalties and restrictions that went along with protectionism. There might not be witch hunts and persecutions like during the Black Death, but there would certainly be civic unrest and related reprisals. Harsh legislation to deal with disorder, a spreading too thin of police resources, the breakdown of law enforcement, vigilantism. The inevitability of roving looters was an idea implanted in his brain by Hollywood, but he knew it had taken root in the collective imagination all the same. Maybe he ought to buy a gun. That is so prescient, it's scary. What is the attraction for an author to want to describe what she perceives as the end of the world?
Well, for me, it sort of came from two things. One was something alluded to in that passage, which is, you know, looking at other pandemic literature and Hollywood stories about disaster and thinking about what they're telling us about human nature. You know, they're so often saying, you know, it's going to be every person for themselves. You got to look out for number one. It's going to be dog eat dog. And I just didn't think that was necessarily true, but I was interested in what effect those stories have on our, you know, unconscious, you know, and what if we start enacting these stories we've been told about who we are. So I wanted to explore what I believe human nature is like and the effect of those stories on our imagination. And I also was just interested in a pandemic as a device that connects a lot of characters. I have a lot of different characters in my book, and a pandemic, of course, connects all of us. And it also has a way of testing us in the way that a crisis can sort of show who a person or a character really is.
We're going to pursue that notion of human nature and how it reveals itself during awful times a little bit later, but I did want to throw out this other perspective in the meantime, and this is from the perspective of a reader who just made this contribution to a website, vulture.com, and she wrote, "Pandemic fiction is about how people behave in response to acute, sudden onset helplessness. When we're confronted with that helplessness in real life, watching some version of it, any version of it, and ideally one where at least some people survive, is comforting. It's a model for how we could respond." And Emma, I wonder, when you were writing your book, did you think to yourself as you were writing it, I want to know more about how people respond under these circumstances?
Yes, I was really impressed, for instance, that so many, I was looking at diaries and letters by nurses or memoirs in which they looked back on their time during the 1918 pandemic. And they remembered it with such nostalgia. I was so impressed that so many of these women, you know, rose to the occasion and felt so needed and useful. So even though it was a grueling time and, you know, people they loved died, they were just so thrilled to be doing important work. So I thought that was one very important thing to capture. I mean, like Salima says, pandemics are irresistible to fiction writers, I think, because they show how people are connected. You know, that kind of, you know, virus invisible thread between us all. It's a great example of how novelists are always trying to show people's connections. And also it's a huge ethical parable. So I think both looking at ways in which people might respond to the personal fear of catching an illness, but also the ways in which healthcare workers respond to the vast challenge of this illness. I think it's a brilliant subject. which is, I suppose, why so many of us have been drawn to it.
Well, let me follow up with this with you, Emma, because unlike the other two books, yours is a real event that took place 100 years ago, and there will be historians who will read your book and certainly have an eye towards whether or not you have been historically accurate when you need to be. Obviously, you can take some liberties where you want, but you do have to, I guess there's some duty to history that you have to make sure that you get some things right. Your book is set in 1980 Dublin. How did you go about researching it to make sure that those historians who would be looking for that accuracy walk away satisfied?
Well, I suppose with all my historical fiction, I do huge amounts of research, and I never ask myself, what's the bare minimum I need? I always just, follow up every little tangent. I go down internet rabbit holes. I just pour my time into it and then only use what's relevant. So I felt a particular pressure to get it right this time because I was talking about medical fact. So in previous books, if I've slightly fudged the matter of, 18th century dress design, really not many people will care. But if it's doctors and nurses reading my book, and most of my fan mail this time around has been from nurses and doctors and midwives, it's really important to get it right. So I was always doing a kind of a double research task on the medical issues. I would look at what sources of the day said, and also at what modern really reliable websites would say, because I was trying to make it physiologically true, but then also check how they would have thought of it back then, and above all, what tools did they have, what understanding did they have. So I would look at something like how the immune system of a pregnant woman might respond by going into hyperdrive in response to the flu. And then I would look back in 1918 and say, okay, they didn't know about the immune system, they didn't know what a virus was, how would they understand it, and what could they possibly do about it? And the answer was usually watch and wait. They had very little to offer. They were dosing their patients with hot whiskey.
I got to say, one of the things that, trying to have 12 kids in the middle of a global pandemic, that was certainly a heck of a trick. Anyway, that's just my little aside. Emily, I want to know why I guess one of the things that distinguish your book is that you really focus on life after the pandemic has already hit, as opposed to during the course of it. Why did you make that choice?
It seemed to me that most of the pandemic, or you know what, I'm going to back that up a little bit. Most of the post-apocalyptic literature I'd read was set in the immediate aftermath of a complete societal breakdown, which is to say this period of mayhem and chaos and horror. And it's not that I don't think that would happen. I think it absolutely would. But it's just not plausible to me that that would last forever, at least not everywhere on Earth. So I found myself just more drawn to and more interested in thinking, well, what comes next? What would be the new world and the new culture that might begin to emerge, say, 15 or 20 years down the line? Might there be space in the world for traveling Shakespearean theater companies and groups of traveling musicians? So yeah, I was just more drawn to that timeline personally.
Now, unlike Emma's book, you're not dealing with an actual real event of 100 years ago. You are free to kind of do what you want. How does one do research in that kind of circumstance?
By researching the past, by reading about the 1918 pandemic, for example. But that being said, I took some pretty serious liberties with the science in this book. Probably the most reassuring thing I could say is that the flu pandemic in Station 11 is not actually particularly scientifically plausible. In actuality, an illness that killed that many people that quickly would burn itself out before it could do too much widespread damage, which I have to say, a shock for me with our current situation was realizing how much social upheaval could be caused by an illness with a single-digit mortality rate. It was kind of shocking to me with COVID. So, yeah, I wouldn't call the flu pandemic in my book particularly scientifically accurate.
That didn't make it any less horrifying when I read the book, I have to tell
Thank you,
just for what it's worth. Okay. Salima, I want to, boy, this is neat. We're going to put up a graphic now, which, because you did a lot of research too, and here's the pandemic you recreated. Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? Here we go. In your book, it starts with a novel coronavirus from Yunnan province in China. There is an anti-Asian backlash. It is a respiratory disease that's airborne and highly contagious. People are quarantined for 3 weeks if exposed, and everybody wears PPE, personal protective equipment. The gyms get closed. Food delivery service skyrockets, as does consumption of media. It makes its debut as a super spreader event in New York City and spreads like wildfire. That is eerily accurate to what has actually transpired. How have you managed to get so much of that right?
Well, I mean, like Emma, I did a lot of research, a lot of internet rabbit holes. And because I was writing for such a long time, I was working on it for so many years that I kept re-researching things. And as new epidemics would break out, I would sort of comb through the news looking for, new developments. I read a lot about the Spanish flu. I read about SARS. I went and read a lot of epidemiology papers showing, the modeling of how infectious diseases spread and how that can be impacted by community mitigation strategies like social distancing and quarantine. So, all this information is out there. As Emily mentioned, epidemiologists have been saying it's not a matter of if, it's when it was going to happen.
But I just have to wonder, when COVID-19 hit and then all of these things started happening, did you start to say, oh, wow, that's like in my book. Oh, wow, that's like in my book. Oh, my goodness, that's exactly like, did you have those moments?
Yes, completely. The whole sort of beginning of COVID-19 unfolding was just a long, prolonged moment like that, for sure.
Given your ability to predict the future, did you then go out and buy a lottery ticket?
This is not the kind of lottery that anyone wants to win. So
no, but clearly you can divine the future. So maybe that's the next step for you.
I will say that, especially because in my novel, there's this extra level of eeriness in that there is a character in my novel who's a writer who has written a book about a pandemic that within my novel seems to be coming true. So there's even like a meta level of eeriness. So I will say that I'm going to think about the next thing I write. I'm going to choose it very carefully.
Was there anything that you had in the book that, as you look at how COVID-19 has introduced itself to us, you thought, oh, I actually kind of got that wrong?
Well, the thing that I find the most astounding, I did have, sort of conspiracy theorists and people who don't want to follow the quarantine rules. But in terms of the anti-mask movement, like I knew that was a thing back in the Spanish flu pandemic, but the degree to which the anti-maskers are an actual movement now, I would have thought in 100 years we would have made some headway. But of course they've been emboldened by that, terrible leader in the South. But
now who might you be referring to there?
That most unfortunate of presidents. But that is sadly shocking to me and something I did not anticipate and is not in my novel.
I should get Emma to comment on that as well. The notion that wearing a mask today somehow became a political statement and the echoes that might have to the time that you wrote about.
That's right. They had both some mask laws in cities like San Francisco in the States and anti-mask leagues. But in 1918, they didn't know what they were dealing with, in that a lot of people wore masks outside and then they would take them off when entering the building as if it was an overcoat. So in every way, I feel lucky to be around today by comparison. For instance, there were political techniques as well as medical techniques that they didn't have back then. There was no such thing as governments paying people to stay home and stay safe. Concepts like, basic income, for instance, just not available then. So the many ways in which governments can, protect us from the larger effects, not available at all to these governments just struggling to get to the end of World War I. So I think this is an entirely different world, and I think our science is in a much stronger state. The very rapid development of a number of vaccines, for instance, no equivalent in 1918. So yes, I'm very aware of the horrors around today, but even more so, I'm grateful that this is now and not then.
Mm-hmm. Emily, I want to take you back 5.5 years, because this was no doubt one of the great highlights of your life. You were on this program. Sheldon, let's roll the clip. Emily St. John Mandel on the agenda 5.5 years ago. Roll tape, please.
I go through a whole litany of things that would disappear in this scenario. No more trains, no more holding up your iPhone to take photographs of concert stages, no more electronica, antibiotics, gasoline, etc. It does end with a paragraph about the internet, which To be absolutely honest, just between the two of us, is something I might not miss. It's been, it's incredibly helpful, obviously, for research and for easily keeping in touch with people. But we are so distracted. And I didn't write this book with the aim of imparting any real message along those lines, but it's something that I think about, that there might be some value in the idea of being a little bit less dependent on, our little mesmerizing phones.
Well, I'm going to want to follow up on that comment. What do you think about your little mesmerizing phones today?
It is a real irony of the current pandemic that we're completely dependent on technology now. That somehow the pandemic has catapulted us into this world of Zoom calls, Skype, FaceTime, Crowdcast. I've gotten familiar with a dozen different platforms. It's funny. I'd somehow always imagined that a pandemic might decrease our technology, and yet suddenly here we are.
No, we have government leaders quite frequently telling us, please download this COVID-19 app into your smartphone because this is the best way that we can track how this thing is penetrating the population. So,
if
anything,
I've got the New York
more
State
dependent.
app on my phone.
You do have the New York State app on your phone?
I do.
Has it rung yet?
No, the thing is, I don't see people. We take quarantine really seriously. I'm in a 3-family pod, so my phone is just never within 6 feet of anybody who's not in our pod. So, hopefully it'll never ring. It's not something I worry about.
Good. Tell me as well, I asked this question earlier of Salima, and I want to get you on this as well. The world you describe is all in your imagination. And yet, presumably you got some of it right as you've watched COVID-19 unfurl. What did you get right?
The sense of fear. But in fairness, that would have been hard to get wrong. It's so inevitable. But I find myself thinking more about what I got wrong, which is, I think the main thing is I referred earlier to that strange interlude where we knew what was coming, but we didn't believe it. I think that before going through this experience, I'd thought of being in a pandemic as something of a binary state. You're either in a pandemic or not in a pandemic. And it hadn't occurred to me that there might be this strange kind of in-between time where you're sort of in it and kind of not. So that's something I think I got wrong. I think I got the dread right.
You got the dread right, I would agree. Emma, let me take you back again to 100 years ago. And governments then, as they did today, or as they're doing today, are trying to give, I guess, the best advice they can to the population. We can have great debates about it today as to how well our governments are advising us on what to do. What's the verdict on how well they advised people back then?
One thing I've been startled by this year is how often the politicians in every era give very mixed, weasel-tongued messages, because they're never simply trying to give scientific advice. They're trying to do things like boost the economy, So back then, just as now, there was a lot of vague reassurance or even a way of talking about the illness that effectively blamed the victims. They would say things like, don't be defeatist, that'll let the germs in, which is a bit like Boris Johnson saying, stay alert, or ways of implying that if you get it, it's because you made a personal mistake rather than because there was no good policy in place. Lots of blaming the poor for pre-existing conditions, blaming those who live in crowded conditions for the fact that, they are going to pick up things from each other. So a lot of emphasis on individual responsibility in a way which really makes no sense when you're talking about, invisible microbes. So I put a lot of government propaganda into my book because I wanted to capture that weird sense in which, the advice you're getting from the authorities might really be intended for crowd control rather than intended to truly give you the most up-to-date information. So writing this book has made me feel passionately pro-science rather than pro-politicians, and a feeling that in every era we need to find our Dr. Fauci's and our Theresa Tams and cling to them as they attempt to work out what's actually true rather than what's politically advisable or expedient.
Well, let me follow up with this, because when this thing first broke, in fact, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Tam both said, don't put a mask on, you probably won't do it properly, and as a result, you'll futz with it, you'll touch your face, and you have a greater chance of contracting the coronavirus if you do that. Now, obviously, they changed their tune when it became apparent that people needed to learn how to wear masks and wear them, and everybody should be wearing them. But But that was a change of advice. Did we have that in 1918 as well?
Oh, yeah, there was complete confusion in 1918. At first, they were saying, let's dose everybody with aspirin. They thought that was the best medicine for bringing down fever. And then they found that people were dying, possibly of the very high doses of aspirin. So there was a lot of like, let's back off on the aspirin. But I think that the difference is that you see scientists fine-tuning their advice and based on things like, are there enough masks for everyone, or should we keep them for the doctors and nurses? So that's tinkering with their advice, but it's not a major shift like, should we attempt to prevent spread or should we not bother? So the difference we're seeing between the kind of anti-maskers who are also anti-vaccine, libertarian, that kind of me for myself and I don't care if somebody's granny dies attitude, that has never been anywhere near the kind of subtle distinctions that the scientists are making between one policy or another. So yeah, scientists may not always agree on every little detail, but they're all basically saying, let us use our collective sense of responsibility to stop other people from dying.
Salima, as the COVID pandemic started in your novel, you've got a character named Owen who had previously written a bestseller on surviving a pandemic, only to see it become a bestseller again. Hello, Emily, incidentally. He starts to freak out as he's seeing the signs pointing to a global pandemic. And I wonder whether you yourself went through all that.
I didn't. I think in some ways, Owen, the writer in my novel, he doesn't have the most pristine character. And so in some ways I didn't want to be like him. So I was had this hyper awareness as, we were getting these news reports, in early March. I was like, okay, I don't want to go stock up on a ton of things the way Owen would do. I don't want to lock myself in my house the way he would do. And I think sort of like Emily said, that sense of unreality, even having done all of this research, even having written this book, even having characters in the book who are hyper aware and who prepare in advance for this pandemic. There's this sense of, oh, it's not quite here yet, or I'm just not sure, when is the day that I pull my daughter out of daycare? And just sort of existing in that weird state of disbelief, even having done so much research and even having imagined a very similar reality in my novel.
Emily, how about you? When February turns to March and then March to April, and then we realize we're really in the thick of this thing here, how much do you start to say, this is sounding a bit too much like something I just wrote 5 years ago?
To be honest, I was relieved that it wasn't nearly as bad as the thing I wrote. I think something I have in common with parents around the world is a deep sense of gratitude that, in contrast to the 1918 pandemic, children so far are usually not severely affected. So there was a feeling of dodging a bullet there, that, this is terrible, but thank God it's not actually Station 11.
Emma, how about you? Same question.
Oh, I've been deeply grateful that so far, not only does COVID not look as bad as the 1918 flu, but that we have so many more tools. The speed with which we can share information. I mean, yes, that allows disinformation to spread too, but in every way, we are more able to rise to this challenge than they were in 1918. And in 1918, they were still in the middle of a global war, which, literally spread the illness as huge populations were moved around the world, but also just sapped people of time and energy and made governments unwilling to cooperate with each other. So, if we mess this up, it's really our fault. It's not that we didn't have the tools.
Yeah, I do recall 100 years ago, they had to cancel the Stanley Cup because one of the participating members, Bad Joe Hall, died in the middle of the Stanley Cup final. And this year they managed to put all the players in a bunch of different bubbles, and they played the Stanley Cup, and they awarded the Stanley Cup, and they gave the public a sense of normalcy that we'd get through it. I mean, that does show some sense of progress, I presume, doesn't it?
Oh, I think there's no comparison. We understood and had diagrams of coronavirus within a couple of weeks. In 1918, they really had no idea what they were dealing with. I think I don't think anything they did got them through the pandemic. I think it just died out on its own, as Emily was saying. So I think we're in a much better state if only we don't allow, the madness of, say, conspiracy theories to undermine the scientific efforts.
Since you're all three so good at predicting the future, here we go. I want to ask you whether you think living through a real pandemic, how you think that will affect dystopian literature going forward. Emily, you want to try that one first?
I predict that fewer people will write about pandemics. Because seriously, who wants to read about this? When you've just gone through it. I don't mean to undercut all of our book sales here, but it's just no longer speculative. So, yeah, I would imagine perhaps fewer pandemic books over the next few years.
Well, isn't that interesting? Because I would take, boy, I hate to disagree with a guest in the middle of a program, but I think we're all utterly fascinated with it now. And don't you think the appetite, it's possible the appetite for this kind of work will be even more intense, isn't it?
I suppose it is possible. I've never, I guess it comes down to personal preference. I've never personally recommended reading Station 11 during an actual pandemic, which maybe comes down to my preferences as a reader, that it's, I find it hard to read about pandemics in a pandemic. But as they say, your mileage may vary. Perhaps other people are having the opposite experience.
Yeah. Well, this person's had the opposite experience. Salima, how about you? How's this going to affect pandemic literature or apocalyptic literature going forward?
Well, I think, from a writer's point of view, I think I agree with Emily. I think there might be fewer books about pandemics in the next little while. Just, speaking for myself, I often am drawn to write something from curiosity. Like I was curious what it would be like to live through a time of disaster and just not as the person who's, stopping the meteor or finding the cure, but just as a regular person. And so, having lived through this, I feel like that curiosity is mostly sated, like I'm curious how this will all, pan out and resolve, but I don't have that drive of curiosity, to write that you need to write a whole novel. But I do think that, because this is the kind of crisis that humanity has faced forever, I don't think that these kinds of stories are going to go away.
Emma, you get the last word.
Well, I think what's been so interesting this year, which I would not have predicted, was the huge boost in interest in the Black Lives Matter movement. That's not a very obvious result of people being afraid of catching coronavirus. So maybe our fiction will emphasize more the kind of extraordinary social changes that you could get when a society's had a really short, sharp shock.
Well, I am going to say that I can't get enough of this stuff right now. I don't know why, but I read Lawrence Wright's book as well. And, we're in historic times, and it requires people like you to get us through it. I guess what I'm saying is I'm disagreeing with Emily again. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. I want to thank the three of you for joining us on TVO tonight. Emily St. John Mandel, Salima Nawaz, Emma Donoghue. Great to have you all on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been fun.
While the front doors of libraries across the province closed back in March, along with so many other vital community hubs, that didn't keep them out of circulation for long. Even before they were allowed to have in-person services again, librarians across the province got to work online and beyond. With us now to explain, in the town of Elgin in Eastern Ontario, Vicki Stevenson. She's the CEO of the Rideau Lakes Public Library System. And in the downtown core of the provincial capital at the big reference library on Yonge Street, there's Vickery Bowles, City Librarian of the Toronto Public Library System. And it's great to have you two with us on TVO tonight. I guess it's a fact that to be a really good librarian in this province, the first four letters of your first name have to be V-I-C-K, is that right?
Well, it seems that way.
Seems to be a thing.
Seems to be a thing.
Yeah. Let me start with this quote from the Globe and Mail about how libraries have been faring during this pandemic. Here's the quote. As life gets more difficult for people who've become unemployed or homeless, Equal access to library spaces and resources is taking on a more profound meaning. Demand for online library services has skyrocketed across the country, with expanded online programming and e-book spending. The Ottawa library system, which had lent out more than 500,000 materials at the onset of the pandemic, saw an increase in temporary cardholders of 5,000 during the lockdown, and in Halifax, cardholders grew by 6,000. Well, this certainly refutes the fact that when the libraries got shut down, everything came to an end. You both had your doors forced to be closed by the state of emergency in the province. So let's find out. Vickery, start us off here. How did people interact with the Toronto library system when you weren't allowed to be open?
Well, you talked about people registering for cards. Our digital access cards were incredibly popular. So once we closed, we had about 4,000 people registering for these cards, and these are people who didn't have library cards up until that point. And then we really made a big change. We've always provided some online programming, but we really made a big change and allowed our staff to develop all sorts of different kinds of programming. And we delivered over 550 programs with 40,000 attendees in just a few months. And that really spoke to this transition to the online environment, which was so critical for people in giving people the opportunity to make those connections.
Let me follow up with you here for a second, Vickery, because
yes.
I've heard people in the post-secondary sector say, if left to our own devices, it would have taken us 10 years to move the hundreds of thousands of courses we offer online,
right?
And we did it in a weekend. I've heard people say that. So
yes.
The follow-up question for you is, how in heaven's name did you do all that?
Well, it was through a lot of innovative thinking and a lot of hard work and dedication on behalf of our staff, who really, we dropped everything. And we just focused on what we needed to do as a result of being closed on March 13th and having to rethink how we delivered our services. So it was just a matter of where there's a will, there's a way, and that's what people did.
Okay, Vicki, how about you? How did you stay in touch with the people who depend on you when the province forced you to close your doors?
Well, I would echo what Vickery said in the sense that our staff really took on a lot of technology very quickly. Some of them are self-professed non-techie people, and our children's program person converted her downstairs basement to a studio space and started doing an interactive Zoom session with all of our families, story time, same thing, same format that they would do in person, with the benefit that they could see each other and kids could share a little bit of their day. They already knew each other. It was a bit of reassurance in a very strange time for young children and families. So to see a familiar face, to be able to sing the same songs, a lot of parents told us it was a real lifesaver for them in those early weeks. And yes, we also pivoted very quickly. I would say by the end of March, we were running virtual story time, something we had never taken on before, but I really have to hand it off to staff how they responded.
Can you follow up on that, Vicki? What do you now do differently because of the pandemic that you might not have thought of doing that way, but now you do and probably will continue to do so?
Well, definitely the online programs for children, story times, are ongoing. We've also expanded it into some more workshops for youth and teens. So right now we're running a yoga workshop series for kids, and that's ongoing. Also, we did curbside pickup for patrons once we were allowed to have the doors open somewhat, and that's been very popular as well. We always did a certain amount of outreach to patrons who couldn't come to us. We would deliver to them as needed, but it's become much more of a staple. People look forward to being able to pick up their bag of books to go.
And Vickery, how about you? What do you do differently now that you're going to continue to do differently?
Well, I'll tell you, a big area of development for us is with food banks. When we closed in March, there was a real need in Toronto for food distribution sites and for people to support those sites. So we opened 12 of our branches for food bank distribution. We repurposed our book sorting and distribution site for food bank sorting and distribution. Our staff volunteered for those sites, and we delivered food to thousands upon thousands of people in Toronto with the support and the leadership, of course, of the Daily Bread Food Bank and North York Harvest Food Banks, and with the City of Toronto. But what's interesting is now that we've opened two of those locations in the northwest area of Toronto, still need those food bank sites, and so we're still operating food bank distribution from those libraries now, even after we've opened. So that's been a huge, partnerships are really important to libraries, and it's been really important as we've moved through this pandemic to have partners in the community where we can work together to serve the community in whatever way that community needs. And that's certainly been what we've been doing here. And food banks has been a huge area of development and service for public libraries here in Toronto.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you on that, because that's nothing that people traditionally think of as being part of the mission of a library system. So where'd the idea from that come from to get involved in that, and why are you doing it?
Well, it was through the discussions with the City of Toronto at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were talking with different groups of staff at the city about what the city needed, and my senior team and I started talking about it and said, well, we're the perfect place for this. We are logistics experts in moving books around. We can move food around too, and we are committed to serving our community. Our staff are committed to serving our community, and if that means when we can do that with food, then that was really important to us. And what was interesting, we saw many of our customers that we see in those branches as library customers. We saw many of those customers at those 12 food distribution sites coming for food as well. And we also distributed 4,000 books. We put books in hampers for children in addition to the food. And we were able to do that through the support of our Library Foundation, which has been tremendous in supporting us with different initiatives like this, and with internet connectivity, which is another area that we've been really working on with community partners.
Let me ask you both about COVID. Okay, Vicki, to you first. Have there been any cases of COVID-19 that you've discovered among either your patrons or your staff?
Not at this moment. The Rideau Lakes region has been, maybe we could say, a bubble within a bubble. There's been very low case counts in this region, according to the Lanark Leeds Grenville District Health Unit. So
far, so good.
So far, so good.
And are you doing, in terms of cleaning, or, when a book comes back in, are you taking extra above and beyond measures to make sure things are clean?
Yes, we have. We developed a reopening guideline document that we did in conjunction with the Public Health Unit and the recommendations of the Ontario public health officials. And basically it covers a wide range of measures we put in place to make sure staff and people coming into the library would be as safe as possible. It includes extra cleaning, disinfection. The books and other materials are set aside for a quarantine period. And we find that our best ally in this as a small library system is to use time. It's on our side to help make sure that when we put items back out on the shelf, we know they've been untouched for a certain amount of time to make sure they have been quarantined.
Out of curiosity, how long does a book have to be set aside before anybody else can get at it again?
Well, it varies from library to library across Ontario and the wider picture. There's been different recommendations people have followed. We have stuck with the 72-hour rule.
Gotcha. Okay, Vickery, same question to you. Any cases that you know of COVID-19 among patrons or staff?
We have 82 branches open of our 100 branches right now, and we have had a few cases of where staff have been diagnosed as COVID positive, and a few customers have contacted us as well. But none of that has been as a result of it being transmitted at the library. It's been through other connections. And when that happens, we have a health and safety protocol in place where we close the branch and we do a thorough sanitation of the branch. And we have this posted on our website so people are aware of it as well. But it's been very, very few cases, and we're certain the library is not a source of COVID transmission.
Yeah, just want to be clear about that. So people had it before they walked into the library, and then that's how it came to your attention because they were in the library.
Yes, afterwards they were diagnosed and they let us know.
Okay, gotcha. It's funny. Anytime I talk to anybody about libraries these days, the first thing they always ask me is, how come they don't charge fines anymore? So let's talk about that. Because it would seem to me, let's start. I'll start with the neutral, open-ended question, and then we'll do all the follow-ups. Okay, Vickery, why aren't you charging fines anymore?
Well, we're not charging fines right now because of this quarantine period. So we're not, when the materials are returned, for Toronto, it's a 96-hour quarantine period. So the staff put them in boxes. They're not checked in, and they go into a room where they are held for 96 hours. Sometimes it can be a bit longer. And so we don't want to be in a position of charging people fines because the material simply hasn't been checked in on time. So that's just, it's not workable. But there is a larger issue about fines, and that is that fines, and there's growing evidence to indicate that fines are a barrier to use, especially in lower income communities and among people who aren't in a position to pay fines. And this has been proven over and over again. And in Toronto, we know that about of our child customers, about 1% of our child borrowers have overdue fines. But in lower income communities, that is about 5%, and they're blocked from using the library. So instead of encouraging people to return their materials, what the overdue fines is doing is it's blocking people from using the library. It's a barrier to service. And so in areas, there are about 200 libraries across Canada have eliminated fines. And in Toronto, we've introduced the elimination of children's fines, which has been endorsed by our library board. We've introduced this as a budget issue for 2021, and we are discussing this with the City of Toronto as a budget to eliminate children's fines in 2021.
Now, Vicki, do I have this right? You guys haven't had fines in your library system for 6 years already?
Since 2014, we eliminated the majority of our fines. We did keep a few in place for high turnover items like the new DVDs when we were using interlibrary loan as well, try and encourage a quick return of those. But for the vast majority of our items, and again, we started with the children's collection as well, not charging fines that way, and then phased them out more or less in the whole system. So it has been about 6 years.
Well, let me ask the dumb, obvious follow-up question here, which is, why would anybody bring a material back on time if there's no penalty for it?
Well, go ahead, Vickery.
Well, the result of other library systems that have gone before us is that people do return them on time, and there's increased use of our collections and resources, especially amongst people in lower income communities. So it doesn't have the effect that we thought fines were going to have. In addition to that, we haven't eliminated fines for materials that aren't returned. So if you don't return something, you still get charged for the replacement of that material. So
okay, but tell me this. What kind of revenue were you looking at when you did charge fines?
Well, our children's fines are about $600,000 a year, and in total, and 1.4 for adult and teens fines. That's about the revenue that we have in fines.
So it's $2 million.
Yes.
That's not nothing. What are you going to do to replace $2 million?
Well, this is our discussion with the City of Toronto.
Okay. All right. So, Mayor Tory, you're down on one knee and saying, please make us whole. We need that $2 million. Yeah. Is that the idea?
Yes, over 2 years, we're suggesting $600,000 for 2021, and then the rest of $1.4 million in 2022.
Now, mind you, like $2 million is real money, obviously, but I'm guessing your budget's somewhere around $100 million, so it's not.
It's $200 million.
$200 million. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is not going to put you in the poorhouse if you don't get this money.
No.
Okay, got it. You're making a bigger point here. I understand. Vicki, your library system is obviously very different from the Toronto system, which is one of the biggest in the world, as we know. So describe your system to us. Rideau Lakes, how does it work?
Well, we are a 5-branch system in a very rural area. We're halfway between Kingston and Ottawa. And so, yes, we have a low population of around 11,000. And we do serve a much smaller base, but I like to think that our library system meets a lot of the same needs in our community that you would find in other libraries elsewhere. So we are happy. Our experience, happily, has been positive. Being fine-free, we have not had an issue with chronic overdues. Some of the good intentions that people bring to using the library, that kind of ethic of sharing, really goes a long way. So we have not experienced either financial hardship or loss to our collections by going fine-free. And I feel that our small size is our strength in the sense that it was never a major component of our budget. And also the fact of we have very personal relationships with our library members. So they come in and we can talk things through with them and be flexible.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm asking this question, Vicki, is because there's an old-fashioned notion that all libraries do is loan books and that's it. And that clearly is an out-of-date notion. So would you be able to give us a better sense about what kinds of services you actually do provide to the public that you serve?
Well, one of our biggest roles, we believe, in our community is helping people explore and gain confidence with technology. Especially in rural areas, our broadband and access to internet can be a little precarious. People's comfort level with accessing online sites, it could be for government forms, it could be for job seeking. We try and help guide them through that process. So we really see ourselves as a leader and guide in using technology. Letting people explore and try out new technologies. We're very excited in the upcoming year to 2021. We're hoping to have a new branch available and with a makerspace in it, something that larger libraries have been able to offer for years now, but this will be something for people to try out things like 3D printing, vinyl cutting, robotics, coding, these kind of things. So even though we may be rural, we're very much watching to see what other libraries do, looking at their best practices and putting them in place when they work for our community. So definitely technology is a big part of that. But we also do so many things, book clubs, programming for, could be book talks with authors, visiting authors, experts, local experts. We really tap into our community to bring people together to learn more and to enjoy the experience of rural living. Connecting with neighbors is a big thing that we do.
And Vickery, for you, beyond the obvious of loaning millions of books out every year, what are the biggest services you provide to the community?
Well, certainly access to technology and the internet. And I think that, libraries have been talking about this for a long time, but what the pandemic has really amplified are digital inequities, the digital divide, and people who've been cut off, digitally disconnected because they don't have access to computers and Wi-Fi and internet. And so, in fact, what we've been developing are internet connectivity kits. And these we give people a laptop, a Wi-Fi hotspot with 2 years of unlimited data and a laptop bag, and we give them this laptop. This is, again, we've done this through our partners and through our foundation support. And we've distributed about 400 of them. We have 1,000 Wi-Fi hotspots. We distribute those to people. I think that people don't, especially in a big city like Toronto, everyone assumes, everyone has access to computers and technology and internet access. Not true. People line up to use our scanners and our printers and our computers. And when we were closed, it was a huge problem for people not to have access to those resources. You think about not being able to talk to your caseworker, connect with your children's school, being able to look for a job, be able to get health information. All of that is only available through the internet and digital resources, and then of course government resources. A huge percentage of library use is people who come into the library to access e-government, and so it's really important to be able to provide those resources for people at a time as critical, especially now when people have lost their jobs, they're worried about their children in school, and there's all this online learning that's happening People need access to technology, they need access to the internet, and they need access to people who can help them use that technology. And that's what library staff do each and every day. They're experts in this area, and the library is an ideal place for people to come to either in person or virtually to get the resources they need to be successful and to make their way through what is a very difficult time for everyone.
Vickery, we're down to our last couple of minutes here, and I did want to raise one more kind of sensitive issue with you, which is that anybody in the big cities who goes to a public library, ours is 2 blocks north of here, I'm there quite frequently, and one sees homeless people there. You know, this may be the one place in the course of their day that they're going to be able to hang out where it's nice. You know, it's a nice place to be, but of course, with homelessness comes other issues that your staff may not have to deal with other patrons. And I guess my question for you is, you know, how well trained are your staff to deal with the problems that come with homeless patrons that you may not have to deal with others?
Well, you know, one of the wonderful things about the public library is that we welcome everyone without judgment. And we welcome people to come into the library, and we serve them in whatever way we can. And a few years ago, we hired a social worker. We've never had a social worker on staff before, and we have one now. And the social worker doesn't work with the public directly. The social worker works with our staff, and to provide them with guidance and resources that they need to serve their customers, and many times they're consulting our social worker about homeless issues. We also have a tremendous network of community partners that we work with at the city and other agencies in the community that we connect with them when we have people in the branch who are homeless and need support. And we also deliver programs directly targeting homeless people to help them in any way we can. Again, it could be a book discussion, you know, or it could be some other kind of discussion group, but that's what we do because people who are homeless are part of our community and they deserve to be served just like anyone else.
That's Vickery Bowles from the Toronto Public Library and Vicki Stevenson from the Rideau Lakes Public Library. It's really good of both of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, November 17th, 2020. How is Canada contributing to the staggering humanitarian crisis in Yemen? Well, tomorrow we'll hear what a new report from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees says. Spoiler alert, it's not at all good news. Also, as TVO airs the riveting documentary series Once Upon a Time in Iraq, we'll find out how that country is faring today. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.